and I'm president of the local League of Women Voters, also known as the League of Women Voters of Umpqua Valley. Please help yourself to refreshments at any time. We hope that you received a note card when you came in so that you can write down any questions that might occur to you, and we'll have a question and answer period at the end of the event. So that you know where restrooms are, you can go out these doors, and immediately to your right you'll find the women's restroom. The men's is out and down the hall a little further and kind of around the back, or it's accessed by going out of one of these doors and to your that way. And let's see, we do want to let you know that we are attempting to live stream this on Facebook, and we hope that you'll be able to watch it or share it later. Despite the name, the League of Women Voters does welcome members of all genders, age 16 and older, and student membership is free. We're always striving to increase and diversify our membership. Membership forms are available on the side table, I believe over here up front, and on our website at lwvuv.wordpress.com. And you can see we've got signs with our web address there. Let's see, if you want to receive email notification of our events, please write your name and email address clearly on the list that's on that table next to the refreshment table. The League's mission is to help voters make informed choices, and we know that every voter wants their vote to count as much as the next person's, but does it? Our speakers, Candlin Johnson and Becky, who's here to help, Becky Gladstone, have come here to educate us about that tonight. I'll tell you a little bit about Becky, and Becky is over here filming, I think. And okay, Becky Gladstone is a stalwart in the League. She is currently the first vice president of the League of Women Voters of Oregon. She has been chair of the League of Women Voters of Oregon's Education Fund, secretary for the League of Women Voters of Oregon, and League of Women Voters of Lane County. And she has served on every LWV of Oregon committee. She currently serves as Voter Service and Education Chair and as Governance Portfolio Coordinator during legislative sessions. So we thank Becky for a lot of work that she does. Our other presenter, Candlin Johnson, has a bachelor's degree in political science from Oregon State University and a long history of nonpartisan advocacy work here in Oregon. After college, she served a year in AmeriCorps, where she coordinated a mentorship program, at Chemeketa Community College for teens at the Boys and Girls Clubs of Salem, Marion, and Polk counties. Before her time in AmeriCorps, she was a board member of the Oregon Student Association and organized a voter registration and education campaign that registered over 4,500 students to vote and contacted over 9,000 voters, Oregonians from across the state, to help them get their ballot turned in. She also has advocated for youth voters in both Salem and Washington, D.C., and educated the public on how to communicate with their representatives and navigate the Oregon legislative process. Currently, she works as a campaign coordinator for the League of Women Voters of Oregon, coordinating forums across the state to educate voters on the issue of redistricting. So, I would like to turn it over now to Candlin.
I always love it when people introduce me. So a couple of things. First off, I am really sick, so if I'm talking a little quieter, I apologize. I'll try and project but I have quite a cold right now, so I will do my best for you all tonight, but that might be why I look like I'm dying a little. And I'm crying. Every time I sneeze, I cry, so it's very dramatic. So besides that, please make sure to grab a note card and sign in. This is a grant-funded project, so I need a head count of how many people come to our events. So make sure that you signed in. If you didn't, you can do so on your way out, and that you get a note card. We're going to be doing Q&A at the end, and so as I'm going through the presentation, if you have questions, make sure to write them down, and then we'll do a 5-minute break, and Becky and I will look through all your questions, and we'll just start answering them on your note cards. So we'll collect the note cards at the end. So there's pens and note cards up there over at that table right over there, so you can grab them. There's also refreshments in the back, so make sure you grab refreshments and bathroom break whenever you want, and we'll go ahead and get started. So the issue of redistricting is a really big issue across the United States, and here in Oregon, every state does redistricting differently, and so we're going to be talking about how does Oregon do their redistricting process, and what does the league actually think should be improved about our current redistricting process. And as you all know, the league always does studies before we make decisions on things, and so there is actually a study on our website as well that you can read. A lot of this information I got directly from the study that was done in 2007. And another study that might be really helpful for you is actually the League of Women Voters elections study, because redistricting and elections actually have a lot. A lot of times you can't talk about redistricting without talking about elections, and so kind of thinking about our election systems and how might different election systems impact redistricting would be a really good thing to play with, and so I'd encourage you to read both those studies on your own time. So let's go ahead and talk about redistricting now. So the first thing is that the census is the first step of redistricting. Every 10 years, we're required to get data about demographics of the United States in order to figure out the changes in populations and how that might impact our representation here in the U.S. So the surveys ask questions about how many people live or stay in each home and the sex, age, and race of each person. And then we really wanted to kind of focus on how this is the first step to voters being engaged in the redistricting process, because federal funds, grants, and support to states and counties and communities are based on population totals and a breakdown of demographics. And so the funding and distribution of funding, the census data is used for that. And that's actually over $675 billion that gets distributed. And it helps communities get its fair share of federal funds that are spent on things like schools, hospitals, roads, public works, and other vital programs. And so this is why the league really wants people to participate in the census in 2020 and in the census, because it's a great way for everyone to be counted and for needs and communities to be represented. The other thing that we wanted to mention too is just the fact that minority communities also benefit when participating in the census. And I don't know if you all have heard about it in the news, but there has been quite a bit of debate about whether this should be a citizenship question on the census. And I just wanted to point that out because that is a big topic right now. And the reason why it's a contentious issue is because minority communities already don't participate in the census at the same level as other citizens here in the U.S. And the reason for that is fear of family deportation or fear of racial profiling. And that is a problem, because if we don't count everyone in our communities, then we don't distribute funds properly and we don't have proper representation. And so that is a debate that I wanted to mention is heavily tied to the census right now that I did not want to ignore is happening here in the U.S. And so keep a lookout for that. And just know that the league is looking at that as well. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about all of the different things that the census data is used for besides just representation. So the census data is used by businesses to decide where factories are going to be built and jobs are going to be created. Developers use the census data to decide where they're going to build new homes and communities. Local governments use it for public safety and emergency preparedness plans. Residents can use this data also to support community initiatives and improve legislation in their area and quality of life consumer advocacy. And lastly, it provides policymakers with information about their voters to best serve their interest. Contrary to senators, of which every state has 2, the number of representatives per state are determined solely based on population. And the census ensures that each community gets the right number of representatives in government by getting an up-to-date tally. So that's how the census is connected to redistricting. So what is redistricting? I just wanted to break that down real quick. So the U.S. Constitution gives the state the power to redraw the lines of both their congressional and their state legislative districts every 10 years. And so the year after the census, every state redraws their districts. And it's important to remember that with our current single-member winner-take-all election system, it really impacts how much of an impact redistricting has in representation. So, for instance, if we had a multi-member district election system, the impact of redistricting would just be less. And that would be because, in general, more voters would have more representation as a whole. And so, I just want you all to keep in mind that our election system does have, it does connect with why redistricting is such a big issue. And the goal for each state the goal for each state is to specialize their districts so that every vote counts equally. But what we know is that when legislators have control of where district lines get drawn, like they do here in Oregon, the risk of gerrymandering drastically increases. And so I just wanted to go over the ways, what is gerrymandering and what are the common ways that gerrymandering is done here in the United States. And so you can see there's this really cool graphic that I found that I think explains gerrymandering pretty well. But just to define gerrymandering real quick, gerrymandering is when elected or appointed officials who are in charge of reconfiguring districts do so in a way that favor a political party, incumbent, or candidate. And most of the time, gerrymandering, when it's done partisan, is very, very clear and easy to see. But there's some gerrymandering that's less obvious, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And one thing I also wanted to point out is that legislative redistricting has such a huge impact on and is just such a large political battle because of the risk of gerrymandering and because redistricting can completely change the control of who has control of the legislature, right? And one thing to point out too is that in 2020, when we get our census data back, Oregon might actually get a 6th congressional district, which should completely change the representation here in Oregon, just because our population's been increasing so drastically, which is why the league really wanted to focus on, well, how do we draw the lines right now? We should really focus on this, especially if we're about to change the way our districts have been drawn for a really long time. And so I just wanted to point out real quick what each of these examples are. So as you can see in number 2, the first example of how gerrymandering is often done is called cracking. And what that is when you spread opposition votes into several districts so that even if all of them turn out to vote, they're never going to win the district. And so you can see here that blue has spread out red into 5 districts so that none of their vote basically doesn't matter. No, even if they vote, they're never going to be able to change the representation, and all of them will always be blue, which is not fair. So that's a very common way that legislators often gerrymander a district. The second common way is called stacking, and that's when you move all of the opposition voters into a couple of districts. And so you can see here that red has done this, and this is commonly used by the minority party in the legislature. If for some reason they have more representation in the redistricting process, they can use this to actually skew representation in their favor. And so you can see here that even though there's less red votes, they end up getting 3 districts while blue gets 2 because they shoved all the blue votes into just 2 districts, which makes these very uncompetitive. And this might actually be an example, number 3 might be an example of both a partisan or a bipartisan gerrymandering, which we're going to talk about real quick. And lastly, I just wanted to point out the example number 1, which says perfect representation. I just want to challenge it real quick. I don't think that that's an example of perfect representation. And the reason for that is because no matter what what people vote, they're never going to be able to change their representation if they really wanted to. Those are super uncompetitive, and we want districts to be competitive. We want voters to be able to change their representation if they want. And so that could actually be an example of a bipartisan gerrymander. So I've mentioned the different types of gerrymandering, so I actually wanted to define that real quick. Partisan is the kind of gerrymandering that's the most easily seen. It's very, very obvious when a party is gerrymandering the district, because you can see that the way that it's drawn gives a certain party or candidate a very clear advantage over another. Bipartisan gerrymandering is a little less obvious. A lot of times it's behind the scenes. It's not easily noticeable. And what it is basically, sometimes it looks as a very fair committee, a bipartisan committee where both parties have a say and talk, right? But what they do is they just negotiate and they say, all right, how about you keep your 2 districts if you let me keep my 3 districts, and then we'll just not change anything and we both win. And so basically what it does is just keep safe districts the way they are, and voters don't get a say in that process. And the last kind of gerrymandering that we want to mention real quick is actually racial gerrymandering. And I don't know if you all have heard about it in the news, but there are a couple of states who have court cases out right now because of some racial gerrymandering. And racial gerrymandering is when lines are drawn to prevent racial minorities from being able to elect their preferred candidates. And I will mention that racial gerrymandering can be used to increase minority representation, but it's very rare to be used that way. And the reason for that is because the Voting Rights Act actually requires that if there's enough of a population of a minority that they make up their own district, and that's much more commonly used to increase minority representation than gerrymandering is, because geography and race are actually pretty heavily intertwined with each other. So I want to talk a little bit about how do we currently draw our districts here in Oregon? Well, we use what's called the legislative redistricting model, and that basically just means the legislator has complete control over where lines get drawn. And this process of redrawing district lines is very, very similar to just how a bill gets passed. So a committee is created, they hold public hearings to get debate and just opinion on the maps, then they pass a map. Then the governor can either veto or sign that map, and then the map is instituted into law. The legislator can override a veto with a supermajority vote. And this process actually gets a lot more complicated very fast if for some reason the legislature cannot decide on a map by the deadline. And we're going to talk a little bit about Oregon history, but that is very common in Oregon history. And so what we have here is actually 2 columns. The first column is if the legislature actually manages to pass a map by July 1st. If they do, then the court can challenge those maps. We can file a petition and challenge the map, and then the Oregon Supreme Court actually gets a hold of that map and requires the Secretary of State to redraw it if the challenge was accepted. What often happens in Oregon history is the legislature has failed to enact a plan by the deadline. Then the legislative districts get kicked to the Secretary of State to draw, and the congressional districts get kicked to the federal courts. And so there's actually 2 separate processes, which can be kind of confusing. And this is the more common path here in Oregon. So how do other states do redistricting? Because I think it's important to kind of see how other states do it before we talk about how we should improve ours. So as you can see, most states use the legislative model. You can see 38 states in red use the legislative model to be able to redraw their districts. And these graphics were taken from fairvote.org, and the picture shows these states. There are some unique twists to the legislative model. So for instance, maybe some of the states have the governor draw the initial map. and then send it to the legislature, making it so the governor can't veto a plan once the legislature passes it, and having the state Supreme Court rather than the governor approve the plan. But they all have a pretty common process that the legislator controls most of the process. And as you can see, there's a couple of states that actually don't use the legislative process, and what they use is what's called a commission model. And there are actually quite a few different kinds of commission models, so we're just going to break down real quick what some of those are. And you can see these states are in orange, purple, and blue. So what is the commission model and how does it work? So the commission model is really different depending on the state. And so the creators of a commission do so with the goal of reducing the potential of partisan, bipartisan, and incumbent protecting gerrymandering. That's the goal of a commission. And there are two key factors to think about when building a commission. The first one that often people ask is, how are commissioners actually going to be selected? Who gets to sit on the commission? And how are they selected? And the second one is, how is the decision actually made to adopt a plan? Once the commission is in session, how do they actually go forth in adopting a plan? What's their criteria? And so we're going to talk real quick about what our criteria here is in Oregon as well. But here's just a quick breakdown of what some of the commissions look like in other states. So for instance, the Advisory Commission, and all these definitions I got from the Brenner Center for Justice, is a commission that draws a map for consideration by another body, such as a legislature, but they don't have any legal power. They're basically just advisors. And this membership can consist of legislators, non-legislators, or a mixture of both. A backup commission is a commission that draws plans only if the legislature cannot agree on a plan, or when the governor vetoes the plan. And the composition of the backup commission varies greatly depending on the state. An independent commission is a commission composed of individuals who are neither legislators or other public officials, and are selected after a screening process is conducted by an independent entity. Legislators may not serve on an independent commission. A political commission is a commission composed entirely of lawmakers or other elected officials. They're usually appointed by the legislature or by party leadership, and can consist of the governor or a chief justice of the state Supreme Court as well. And lastly, a political appointee commission is a commission composed in whole or in part by individuals who are directly appointed by elected officials or party leadership. In some states, the membership is evenly divided between the parties, but in other states, this kind of commission could end up having more representation of one party over the other. So what is the criteria that legislators currently use when drawing district maps here in Oregon? There's actually two different sets of criteria. One is criteria that's required by federal law or court cases, and then there's criteria that's actually set in our Oregon statutes. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is what's actually required by all states and federal law. And the first one is that each district must be of equal population. And in Oregon specifically, we require that no district have more than a deviation of 1%. That's required, so we're very strict about that. And this coincides with the one person, one vote doctrine. It really is something that strives for equal representation and equal vote, so that every vote has the same weight. The second is the Voting Rights Act requires special districts that are a majority of minority voters make up their own district. Also keeping into mind that that group of minorities also have a shared community of interest. So, because not all minorities are a part of a community. So that's something that's also required by the Voting Rights Act. Districts must be contiguous, so all parts must be connected. And lastly, congressional districts must be single-membered. So this is very common, the way the districts usually run, but it's actually required that you can't have a district with more than one representative in it. So what's actually required in Oregon statutes? So we require that districts be contiguous, that they be of equal population, that they respect geographic barriers so that they can divide communities so that they can divide communities and keep representatives from communicating with all their constituents. They also require that you respect current political boundaries so as to not confuse voters by constantly shifting the boundary lines. They require that you maintain respect for communities of interest. And communities of interest can be defined as communities that have a shared ethnic, geographic, socioeconomic, or other shared interests. They require that if a district has connections via transportation links, that it can actually help determine where districts are, because they can easily identify communities of interest, and the legislators can actually be able to reach their constituents more easily if those are connected by transportation links. Secondly, we require that no district shall be drawn for the purpose of favoring any political party, incumbent, or candidate, and diluting the voting strength of any language or ethnic minority group. Also here in Oregon, we require nesting, which is where two state House representative districts must fit wholly into one senatorial district, state senatorial district. And so you may have noticed that that is the thing that we do because it's required. And lastly, those who draw the maps are prohibited from knowing the location of an incumbent or candidate's residency. And they also are not allowed to use voter history data when drawing maps. At least that's what it says in law. Another generally used criteria that's not really specified, but it says that they try and do, is that they try and make districts as compact as possible so that constituents and legislators can actually talk to each other. So let's talk about the history real quick, and sorry that the words are kind of off, but I'll read it for you. So why might this system not be the best for Oregon? Well, actually, it's because it's never worked. It's very inefficient. And so actually, the history is that, so according to the 2012 City of Portland Club report, prior to the Oregon legislators' success in 2011, when they actually did pass a map by the deadline, 1981 was the last time the legislature successfully passed a redistricting plan. But following a lawsuit, the Secretary of State had to redraw that plan. Before 2011, the last time the Oregon legislature passed a redistricting plan that became the final adopted plan was 1911. That means that in 100 years, the legislature repeatedly failed to adopt a redistricting plan, either due to partisan differences and not being able to agree or legal challenges. And in the case of 2011, it's actually considered a special case here in Oregon, because the last time we did our redistricting plan, we did actually end up being able to pass something by the deadline. But the reason for that is the House was actually very evenly divided. And then we had Senator Courtney, who really values bipartisanship. So we had a bipartisan committee that was also very motivated to keep it out of the hands of the Secretary of State. And so what we got actually was a bipartisan gerrymander here in Oregon in 2011. And Ballotpedia actually did a study to test what were the competitiveness of the elections after the successful redistricting plan in 2011. And what they found was that there were 4 competitive races for Oregon House of Representatives in 2012 compared to 3 in 2010. There were 5 mildly competitive races, House races in 2012 compared to 9 in 2010. This actually amounted to a net loss of 3 competitive elections after the redistricting plan. So what's the reason for this dysfunction? Why is the legislature not able to pass a plan? Well, most of the time it's because they simply can't agree on a plan, meaning it fell to the Secretary of State to draw the maps. In other cases, lawmakers agreed, but then it was vetoed by the governor. And then in other times, many times, there were legal challenges. And so the Supreme Court actually ended up making the final decisions on maps. So after learning some of our history, we've seen some overall problems. And the league, this is really what the league found were the overall problems with our current system. Especially because there are many steps and revision to this process, it's really caused quite a lot of confusion, and it's very complicated. The first is that the timeline itself is very unrealistic and very short, especially if the legislature can't agree. The Secretary of State has little to no time to pass a new map, and so this is very unrealistic and very challenging for the folks in the process. The second is there's a splitting of the legislative and congressional drawing of the districts if the legislature can't agree on a plan, which can become very confusing. And the review process for the Supreme Court is very awkward and unwieldy and hard to navigate. And that can be challenging because we want voters to be able to challenge the maps if needed. There's a lack of an acknowledgement that the process will always be political and use of that knowledge to limit the politicalization of the process. And lastly, there's just an inherent conflict of interest when legislators draw their own districts. So in our current legislative model, it actually allows space for abuse, such as partisan and incumbent protecting gerrymanders here in Oregon, partisan conflict in a split legislature and or executive can actually lead to an inefficient process, as we've seen a lot in Oregon history, and a failure to create a map. And lastly, because redistricting is a legislative duty like passing bills is, it can actually be used as a bargaining chip to punish or reward legislators for supporting certain maps or doing certain things with redistricting, which is quite a problem. So now that we've talked about the current system and some of the problems, let's talk about what would we try to do to aim at alleviating some of these problems that the league has found. So after extensive research, the league has come to the position of supporting reform in the form of a multi-partisan independent commission. And the way that we would do this and why we would do this is because the league supports reform over the current process, because we recognize that maps drawn to protect incumbents are less likely when non-legislators draw district lines. If a commission is multi-partisan or non-partisan in membership, partisan and bipartisan gerrymanders are less likely. Independence of a commission keeps redistricting from becoming a bargaining chip in the general legislative process. And lastly, maps drawn should focus on lines, not the politics. So what would our goals of reform be? First off, we'd want to change who draws the lines. Take the process out of legislators who have a clear conflict of interest and put it into the hands of voters, of citizens. We want to set up a more neutral backup than the Secretary of State. And we want to authorize a neutral court to handle legal challenges related to redistricting. We want to change the criteria to make it more clear where the lines get drawn. So add a criterion to promote competition and emphasize how important representation is and to increase representation here in Oregon. We also want districts to be representing people, not geography. We want to strengthen transparency and public participation in the process by actually codifying into law a requirement to hold at least 10 hearings across Oregon on draft maps, and at least one hearing in each congressional district once a map has been approved and is waiting to be voted on, so that voters can actually see the final map that's being proposed. We also want to end the use of wink and nod data, political data in the process that's used behind closed doors. And the reason for this is because when legislators are experts of their own districts, they get to choose who they want their voters to be. Lastly, we want to close current loopholes in our system that allow abuse. And one of the biggest loopholes is actually not specifying that redistricting can only be done the year after the census. And what we would want to do is close that loophole by not allowing what's called midterm redistricting. And there's actually an example of how midterm redistricting can be very bad for voters. And that was in Texas in 2003. What happened was the Republicans took control of the legislature in 2003, and they said, hey, we want to redraw district lines. We can do this. And so they did. They redrew district lines, and they increased their representation from 15 to 21 total House seats, and it did not go over well. Democrats tried to flee, but it ended up passing. And this actually was challenged in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, that we don't have a problem with this. And so it's really up to each state to actually close this loophole. And just another clarification we want to make and close the loophole, we want to make sure that the commission is ongoing so that they can't on the side be a public official. We want them to be, we want them to have this as their full-time job while they're on the commission. And we also want to clarify the timeline for congressional redistricting because it's not as clear. So let's actually talk about what our proposed reform is and how it would function. What would this commission actually do? How would we select the commissioners? So this, if we were to actually reform our current process, we would need a constitutional amendment. So that's important to recognize. And we would be repealing the legislative model for the multi-partisan independent commission model, and our goal is to have it be enacted by 2021, which is our next redistricting session. The following slides are going to explain the proposed for reform by the League. Of course, this isn't set in stone, and the League is really open to debate on this process. This is just what the League has proposed after doing research would be a good model. But it's not the only model out there, as you noticed. And so let's go ahead and talk about how the League believes this process could prevent abuse and limit gerrymandering. So the first step would be to create that independent entity to actually screen applicants and get conflicts of interest out of commission applicants. And so the way that we would be doing that is actually creating an applicant review panel made by retired judges. So the Secretary of State would take a pool of retired judges here in Oregon and draw 3 randomly until they have selected one judge who's been registered for at least 2 years in the largest political party here in Oregon, one judge who's been registered for at least 2 years in the second largest political party in Oregon, and one judge who has been registered within the last 2 years with neither of the two parties above. So how would the commission applicants actually be screened? How would we get conflicts of interest out of our multi-partisan commission? Well, in order to qualify for the service of being able to apply for the commission for at least 4 years immediately preceding the date of an applicant's appointment, the applicant must be continuously registered to vote in the state of Oregon and registered with the same political party or unaffiliated with a political party. The Secretary of State then shall remove individuals with conflict of interest from the applicant pool if they are or were related to an immediate family member who was in the last 5 years appointed or elected or ran as a candidate for a federal or statewide office, an officer, employee, or paid consultant of a political party or of the campaign committee of a candidate for elected federal or state office, an elected or appointed member of a political party central committee, a registered federal, state, or local lobbyist, a paid employee of the Legislative Assembly or Congress or executive branch of the federal or state governments, a contributor of $2,000 or more in money, loans, or in-kind contributions to any congressional, state, or local candidate for elected public office in any year, and are not staff or consultants under a contract with, or any person with immediate familial relationship with, a member of the Legislative Assembly, a member of Congress, or any individual elected to statewide public office. That's a lot of requirements, right? But we're really trying to clear out those conflicts of interest. For a period of 10 years, from the time of their appointment until a new commission is selected, an appointed commissioner would also not be able to hold any elected public office at the federal, state, county, or city level here in Oregon, and also would not be able to hold any paid or appointed federal, state, or local public office, serve as a paid employee of Congress, the legislature, or as a registered paid lobbyist in the state of Oregon. So after conflicts of interest have been screened out, how would the commissioners actually be selected? So the applicant review panel would form the remaining applicants into 3 pools. 20 from the largest political party here in Oregon, 20 from the second largest political party here in Oregon, and 20 who are unaffiliated or not registered with the two other parties. And in public, the Secretary of State will then randomly draw 7 names until they have drawn the following, and you'll see a pattern here. 2 from the largest political party in Oregon, 2 from the second largest political party in Oregon, and 3 who are not registered with either of those parties. So after the first 7 commissioners have been selected, those 7 commissioners are going to review the remaining applicants for qualified skills and then vote with a majority vote for the last remaining 4 commissioners with the following: 1 from the largest political party, 1 from the second largest political party, and 2 who are not registered with either of those parties. The commission will then select a vice chair and a chair who cannot be from the same party, and they will start the process of drawing district maps. The final commission, as a wrap-up, would be 3 members from the largest, 3 members from the second largest, and 5 members who are not members of those 2 larger parties. And before we start on how this commission would actually go about drawing districts, I just wanted to talk a little bit about where this process came from and why we have such a clear process for screening out conflicts of interest. And the reason for this is because we want it to be citizens who are in charge of this process, right? And lastly, this is actually drawn directly from the Californian process, and they've actually had a run at it. So there is an example of how competitive their races were after using their multi-partisan independent commission, and it was found to be successful in making districts more competitive. Lastly, the screening process and the process of selecting commissioners is about having citizens and not politicians drawing district lines. So how would this independent commission actually operate? What would be their requirements? Well, first off, members would be compensated. It's important to know that volunteers would have a harder time making this commitment. The commission will comply with state law governing public records and meetings. Official actions by the commission would require a vote of 7 or more, and 7 would constitute quorum. In order for a map to be passed, there would need to be a vote of 7 or more, and you can guess how those votes need to be. At least one of those needs to be from the largest political party, 1 needs to be from the second largest, and 1 needs to be unaffiliated with those 2. They will hold at least 10 hearings in locations across the state before proposing a final map, and at least 1 hearing in each congressional district before passing their final proposed map. The commission members and staff may not communicate with or receive communication about redistricting matters outside of a public forum, with the exception of talking with other commission members, staff, legal counsel, and consultants. Members are required to give appropriate notice for the time and locations of public meetings and hearings. Records and data used by the commission must be posted in a manner that ensures immediate and widespread public access. And certified maps, if challenged, are to be reviewed and approved by the Oregon Supreme Court if the challenge is accepted. So what would the commission's required criteria be? Well, we would obviously still have to follow federal law. And we would keep all of the current required Oregon criteria in the Oregon statutes. We would just add a couple things. So what we would add is that districts should be designed in a manner that achieves both partisan fairness and competitiveness. We would want to preserve the geographic integrity of communities of interest, which includes cities, counties, school districts, and special districts. We want to establish district boundaries that follow permanent and easily recognizable geographic features, such as rivers and control access highways. And we want to limit the amount of time it would take to travel across each district, taking into account the number of legislators per district. So actually making that general use criteria of compactness a part of our statutes. So how would we actually enact reform? I mentioned this a little bit before, but we would have to have an Oregon constitutional amendment. The process for a constitutional amendment either goes through the legislature as a referral or as a petition, an initiative. And the way that would go on is if the amendment is proposed by petition, in order for an amendment to have a ballot title created, it needs to receive 1,000 signatures. And then the petition committee can be formed and the ballot title can be created. Once the ballot title is created, then there needs to be a bigger commission, and there will need to be this number of signatures as the last gubernatorial election, which was a couple days ago. So I don't know what that number is yet. So I thought it would be fun if we ended this with a video. So I'm going to go ahead and have us play that real quick.
As a map maker, I can have more of an impact on an election than a campaign. More of an impact than a candidate. When I, as a map maker, have more of an impact on an election than the voters, the system is out of whack.
So I thought that video was fun, a little dramatic but fun. And I don't know what's going on with that. So I want to just repeat the quote that they used there. They quoted David Winston, who drew those districts for the GOP after the 1990 U.S. Census. And what he says in the video, I think, is really just a great closing line. And what he says is, as a map maker, I can make more of an impact on an election than a campaign, more of an impact than a candidate. When I, as a map maker, have more of an impact on an election than the voters, the system is out of whack. And that must be the Windows update. So, and another update, my bad. So let's talk about what's next. So we really want to encourage the league members and just people in general to participate in the census in 2020 and encourage everyone you know to participate in the census. It's the best way to get involved in the process. We just want to say thank you for coming to this forum. Sorry for the screeching. And feel free to contact me. My contact information is up there if you have any questions, would like materials, or just have anything else you'd like to ask. Maybe you think of something later that you want to ask, so you can write my contact information down. Make sure to let people know about this forum, because we're actually having forums across the state. This is only our third out of 14 forums. And so if you have some friends, say in Bend or something, and you know that they're really passionate and want to get involved, then you can let me know, and I will share with you all of the different forums that we have. But you can also find a list of our forums on our Facebook page or our website. So right now we're going to go ahead and start with our Q&A session. We're going to take a 5-minute break while we go ahead and collect your note cards. So go ahead and write down your questions and turn them in, and we will reconvene in 5 minutes to answer your questions.